Happy birthday, Granny. Edna Ann Lofton was born April 10th, 1926, in Birmingham, Alabama, to Will and Ruby Lofton. My grandmother was born the oldest of 13 children, 11 survived. My grandmother grew up in the Jim Crow South, and during which time she endured a lot of racism. My great grandfather, Will Lofton, worked in a factory, and oftentimes he wasn't able to come home because the Klan would ride around the city to find someone to lynch. And so he and his coworkers hid in the factory while their wives and children stayed in the quote unquote colored section of town. When the Klan couldn't find someone, they would then ride through the colored section of town and terrorize the wives and children who were left at home. My grandmother Ruby didn't work, which was an oddity and a privilege amongst Black women because she wasn't someone's maid. She did take in laundry here and there, but she wasn't leaving her house or her children to go and work in someone else's house as a maid. My grandmother was the oldest of eight daughters and four sons. My grandfather, my great grandfather, was big on trying to get my grandmother to work and earn money. So my grandmother and her sister, Elaine, who was the second oldest, would go from house to house in the white section of town and ask them if they needed help doing anything. So they would go in and they would clean or help with laundry. But my grandmother wasn't really good at giving other people money. My grandmother has always loved her own money. But in one of the jobs she had, she was cleaning and doing housework, and she would make sandwiches. And my great uncles and my great aunts would come along, and my grandmother would hand the sandwiches out the window to them to eat. She didn't keep that job long. Another job she had was with a white woman as a maid, and she was probably 14 or 15 years old. She said she'd spent most of the week at this lady's house talking to the woman's teenage daughters and not really doing a whole lot of cleaning. And at the end of the week, the lady said, "Well, Edna, I could give you the money you earn, or I'm getting rid of all of these clothes from the girls. They've outgrown them. Would you like to have the money or the clothes?" And my great grandmother sewed her children's clothes. So these weren't store-bought clothes that my grandmother and her siblings wore. And my grandmother saw these clothes and she thought they were just so beautiful. So she took the clothes instead of the money. And when she went home, my great grandfather was so angry with her. He was like, "Edna, you just won't do right," because she didn't bring home any money for him. But eventually she did get a little older. She met my mother's father, and they had my uncle, and they got married. They proceeded to have a couple of more children about every 18 months. And eventually they moved to Akron, Ohio in 1948. So my mother was the first of her children born in Akron. My grandmother went on to have one son and six daughters and 10 granddaughters. She's the great grandmother of seven at this moment. When she moved to Akron, she and her husband and their children stayed with his family for a while before getting a home in the projects on the east side of Akron called Ardella Homes. So if you're familiar with Joy Park, or what was Joy Park, that's near where Ardella Homes were. And my grandmother proceeded to try and raise her children. But my mother's father did not like to keep a job. He would not go to work. So he kept getting fired or quitting. And finally, my grandmother told him, "If you lose one more job, I'm going to divorce you." And sure enough, He lost another job. And my aunt, my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, was the one who caught him and told her, "Hey, I saw him in the park feeding the birds." And my grandmother was so disgusted, and she was very pregnant with my aunt Sue, and she'd gone to St. Thomas Hospital, where she told the nuns, "I have to have a job." And the nuns said, "We'll tell you what, you come back when that baby is 6 months old and we'll give you a job." And my grandmother came back and she took that job, and she put James McWhorter out of their home because he wouldn't work. So, what was the point of him living there? And she began to support all five of their children on her own. My mom said she remembers going to the hospital with my grandmother because my mother was 4 years older than my Aunt Sue. And my grandmother came back and my mom had a sucker. And my grandmother said, "Where did you get the sucker?" And my mom said, "Oh, from the bride," meaning one of the nuns. I remember this photograph is great because I remember asking my grandmother, "Granny, were you ever thin?" And she was like, "Yeah, baby, I was thin." And she sent me this photograph, and I realized that thin is subjective. But my mother's father decided that parenthood just wasn't for him, and he drove off to California, leaving my grandmother and their five children in Akron. And he did not come back until much, 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 much later. So my grandmother was raising all five children single handedly. And in the 1950s, the mid 50s, even in Akron, that was really a tough time for women and for Black women. I remember my grandmother telling me about a time when she went to Woolworth's downtown Akron, and she was allowed to get food. So she was eating um, hot dogs with her sister in law, but she wasn't allowed to sit at the counter. So even in the North, where we are told that, oh, racism wasn't the same in the North as it was in the South, and there wasn't the same kind of discrimination, there really was the same type of discrimination. My grandmother met her second husband, Thomas Humphrey, who I know as my grandfather, um, in the mid 50s, and they got married and they proceeded to have two more daughters. So that brought her total number of children up to seven, six daughters and one son. My grandmother was a member of the Baptist church on the east side, and she was a member of the Y Moms. And she was real pretty. She might not have been real thin, but she was beautiful. My grandmother decided she wanted her high school diploma because she did drop out of high school when she was fairly young. So she went back to school, and she went to night school so she could get her actual diploma. So she finished her diploma, and then she went to college and got a degree in occupational therapy. My grandmother and her sisters, all of them were just gorgeous. Many of her sisters had green eyes and blue eyes. And my Aunt Lucille, my great Aunt Lucille, she used to do nail decoration in the 70s and early 80s, way, way, way before it became popular. She was well before her time. My grandmother loves going places. She's not really big on music, but she's big on going. So if you're going, she's going. My grandparents bought a house on Akron's west side, and yes, it was redlined. Redlining in Akron looked different than redlining in Cleveland or Chicago or Boston, but redlining existed in any major metropolitan city where there were a lot of Black people. So they did buy a home on Hardesty Boulevard in the working class section where Blacks were allowed to buy. However, my grandmother was always in love with California. This is my grandmother with me and one of my cousins, and I'm not entirely sure of his name. My grandmother was determined that one of us was going to be in the movies or a model. So she had put my cousins and myself in modeling classes and dance classes. And most of us had zero talent, but she was just determined that one of us was going to be a movie star or doctor. And none of us are, but it was a great ambition that she had for us. She used to come to my ballet classes and crochet. I've even got one of the Afghans, a couple of her Afghans, that she sat and crocheted while I took dance classes. My grandmother also, she was one of the world's worst drivers. She drove so slow. She hugged the curb. And I remember getting up on Saturdays and listening to AM radio because that's what she listened to. So I knew a whole lot of Melissa Manchester songs and hugging the curb all the way to my ballet class and all the way back. I didn't know that it didn't take that long to get anywhere because my grandmother drove extraordinarily slow. And she always lost the car. She never knew where the car was. We'd come out of Acme on the Worcester Hawkins Plaza, and she would never know where the car was. I always knew where the car was, but she never asked me, so I never told her. She got mad at me one time when I told her that I always knew where we had parked. But I remember going to Toledo with my grandparents, and it was the longest drive on earth. I did not know that my grandmother was not taking the turnpike. I didn't know that my grandparents were going the entire route to get to Toledo, and we stopped at every farmer stand between Akron and Toledo. And when we got to Toledo, I would be in the back seat with corn, tomatoes, peppers, any kind of food in the world. Oops. My grandmother and I used to bake a cake every week. And every week we would ask my mother if she wanted some cake, and my mother would say no. And by Wednesday, there would be no cake. We cooked the cake on Sunday. We ate the cake on Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday, there was no cake. And that would always be the day my mother would come back and say, "Hey, I would like a little cake." There was never any cake. When my parents got divorced, or during my mother's divorce, I stayed with my grandparents off and on, and then my mother and I moved in with them. And when my grandfather passed away at the end of 1982, my mother and I moved in with my grandmother full time. And yet my grandmother still loved California. This is my grandmother and my great aunt Elaine. I spent almost as much time with my great aunt Elaine as I did with my grandmother. This is my grandmother and her brother Richard, aka Bubba. And I believe that's either Rhonda, my cousin Rhonda, or my cousin Ingrid, but I believe it's Rhonda. And again, my grandmother was never the thinnest gal, but she was always gorgeous. My grandmother joined Iota Phi Lambda Sorority Incorporated. It was years and years and years before I understood that Iota Phi Lambda wasn't the same as like AKA or Delta Sigma Theta, but she adored it. This was the last Easter that we spent on Hardesty, and this was in 1985, right before my grandmother moved to Southern California. And this picture is very, very dear to me because this is my cousin Carmen, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And my grandmother came back for her graduation. And in this photograph is my grandmother, Carmen, and Carmen's other grandmother, Aunt Mildred, who was possibly the kindest woman I've ever known. And here is Malibu Edna. My grandmother moved to California in 1985, and she still lives there to this day. My grandmother moving to California put her in closer proximity to Las Vegas. My grandmother loves gambling, loves gambling. And she took me to Las Vegas, I think in 1995. So 1995 going into 1996, because it was New Year's Eve. And we went to Vegas, and I don't gamble. And we're in the casino, and I was bored because we weren't even on the strip. We were in the downtown part. And I kept saying, "Well, Granny, I want to go outside." And she was like, "Oh, no, you can't go outside, but you can walk around the casino and come back and let Granny know where you are." My grandmother is also extremely short, but don't let her fool you because she'll tell you that she was my height once. She's never ever been as tall as me. My mother adored my grandmother so much. And so for her 50th, she and my grandmother met up in Las Vegas to party. I remember that. My mother came back super broke. My grandmother lived in Los Angeles with my Aunt Phyllis and my Aunt Edna Jean, my Uncle Oscar, and my Aunt Renee. And my cousins, Fallon, Celeste, Andrea, and Holly. And this is a photograph not too long before I lost my mom. And this is a picture of my grandmother with almost all of her daughters. My Aunt Edna Jean is the only one not in this photograph. But in this photograph, the only people who are still with us are my Aunt Sue and my Aunt Hannah. And my grandmother, periodically she would come back to Toledo or Akron for holidays. And she came back when my cousin Celeste had her babies. And this is a photograph with my grandmother with her great grandchild Jasmine. This is my grandmother with her oldest great granddaughter Jamaica, and Jamaica's the oldest great grandchild. Period. Jamaica is a nurse, and she's super educated and super beautiful, and we're all so proud of her. This is my grandmother and my oldest aunt and my Aunt Sue. My grandmother has lost several of her children, unfortunately, but her oldest, Oscar, he is still with us. And this is the senior center. She made me laugh so about the senior center. She would talk about going and just eating so good. And you'd ask, well, Granny, what did you eat? And she would describe it. And I would be thinking, I would eat someone's face if that is the little bit of food that they gave me. But of course, getting older, you start to eat less. The last time that a lot of us were together was um, was July 4th of 2016. And so this is my grandmother with several of her grandchildren and her great grandchildren and my aunts, my Aunt Sue and my Aunt Hannah. This is my grandmother with my Aunt Phyllis and my Aunt Sue. My Aunt Phyllis had a heart and lung transplant, and she was with us a very, very long time with her heart and lungs. She was very brave, and it was amazing. We were so grateful that she survived that long, but unfortunately we've lost my Aunt Phyllis as well. My grandmother unfortunately has lost um several of her children. She had a child that didn't live past infancy, and then she lost my mom, my Aunt Phyllis, and my Aunt Renee. But here is my cousin and her two daughters, and my Aunt Phyllis, and my cousin's older daughter. Last year, my one of my older cousins and my two aunts went out to visit my grandmother and my Aunt Etna Jean. And this is at the senior center. My grandmother was big on the senior center, and up until last year, she was still going with regularity. And here's the apartment. This is an avocado tree, and I'm very jealous because I would love to have an avocado tree. And it's a blessing to have a grandmother who has lived a century, who has seen so much. She was born in Jim Crow. She lived to see uh, an African American man become president. She lived to see the moon landing. She lived to see so many wonderful things. She's owned homes. She's raised children. She's seen grandchildren and great grandchildren. So happy birthday, Edna. Happy birthday, Granny. I hope it's a blessed and beautiful day for you. And here's to many, many more. I love you.